public school closes for good. Some call it a shuttered school. Some say decommissioned. By any name, the structure becomes an empty building no longer needed by the governing school district and a likely candidate for demolition. This is a story about a school that narrowly missed that fate. In 1924, Roosevelt Elementary School first opened its doors to welcome children of Ames, Iowa. Located on land that was at the time close to the city limits, it was constructed in an age when public buildings were designed to inspire. One architecture scholar, Tom Leslie, calls the style 20th century civic classicism. It was a style very typical for the era and was used to convey a sense of monumentality and permanence. In addition to the exterior mass of the building, Roosevelt's architect, Alan Kimball, included details such as special brick patterns, large windows, tall ceilings, and ornate finishes. Former Roosevelt principal Dallas Rust.
I am an Ames girl, born and raised in Ames. Therefore, I knew a lot of people, my classmates, that had gone to Roosevelt. So I had been to the school, I had seen the school, I had been to the neighborhood, and I formed a very good opinion about that. I think more a sense of vastness when I was a little child. It's just that all of the hallways were huge. They were so wide, grand and big and massive and strong. Very, very encompassing in a safety sense.
As an adult and school administrator, Dallas Rust came back to the building in her professional life. While the massiveness of the building that inspired awe was still present, over the decades, parents, students, and faculty began to see Roosevelt School in another way.
It was so interesting that if you're an administrator going into lots of different buildings, you get a feel for the building within the first 5 minutes. And we call them warm buildings or cold buildings. And Roosevelt was always a warm building. I would go in, I would always feel comfortable even before I was the administrator there.
It was the activities of the children and the relationships developed from those activities that helped create the warm, inviting spirit of the school. From its earliest days, Roosevelt School had a maypole party to celebrate spring. And in a time when Christian religious symbols were still present in schools, there were Christmas programs and Easter egg trees. Through the decades, Roosevelt was the location for after-school activities such as Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts. There were also campfire groups that were part of the social experiences for the children. During the summer, organized playground sessions gave the neighborhood residents another chance to identify with the school. And on a summer afternoon, there was a neighborhood parade near the streets of 10th and Curtis that helped celebrate Roosevelt School. For many decades, those activities played out in a continuous stream of neighborhood 5-year-olds entering the school and emerging after 6th grade, ready for the next step in their education. And while Roosevelt alumni distinguished themselves in many ways, at least one became quite famous: National Basketball Association star Harrison Barnes. His success reminded neighbors that great things can happen from a small and cohesive community school. But Ames was changing. The population was moving to the periphery of the town, and the city center schools were closing. Before Roosevelt's future was in doubt, elementary schools along the town's main corridor had been closed, and one in another area of town was no longer used for classes, but it had been turned into an administration building. In addition to the population shifts, declining enrollment and funding formulas were playing havoc with the school district's budget. By the year 2005, the problems could not be ignored, and the school district felt another school closure was in order. Tim Taylor, superintendent of the Ames School District, was not head of the district when financial problems became acute, but he was a member in administration at the time and remembers the dynamics of the situation about Roosevelt.
That building was actually closed in 2005. And as you mentioned, it was really at that time, as I recall, and all the work that went into that, it was really a financial situation. You reach a point where you have to start looking for ways every year, and I can tell you in the 24 years that I've been here, there's only been 1 year that we have not had to make some kind of budget cuts in order to balance our budget. That was the real crux of the problem in 2005. The enrollment had declined to the point where it became very evident that we needed to look at ways that we could trim our budget to make sure that things would balance. I believe the superintendent there was W. Ray Richardson, and he was looking at nearly $1.8 million in budget cuts, and where we were going to find that was going to be a problem. Roosevelt was identified primarily because of its age, and not so much the location, even though it was located in the center of town. Our population had kind of, by our own development since 1985, had kind of gone to the perimeter. Financially, closing a building generally saves the district anywhere from $250,000 to $400,000 a year. So it was just not financially feasible, so opening up another attendance center within the district.
And just before I retired, we had bought up land. We had put on a new roof. We had a new boiler. We had paved the parking lot. We had 2 houses. Actually, we had all 3 of the houses that were on the rest of the block committed that if they sold, they would sell them to the school district. So I was in high hopes that Roosevelt would be there forever. And so when the news came, I was devastated, both personally and professionally.
Ames, Iowa was not alone in the school closing dilemma. The Pew Charitable Trusts sponsored a national study of shuttered schools looking at what happened to empty education buildings in 12 large cities across the United States. From 2005 to 2012, the study examined properties that had been decommissioned, some of them left crumbling for more than a decade. And at one point, Roosevelt School also was in danger of being a blight.
I know we did have some vagrants that moved in. We had some damage that was done to the building by people who would break windows or other ways to gain access. We know that we had some vagrants that were living in it, but the police would check that regularly and we would chase them out. So there was some damage and other destruction to the inside of the building from people who would get into the building and just do some nasty things. We did have one fairly serious fire that took place because a vagrant had moved in and for whatever reason began to start a fire, but we were very lucky that some of the neighbors caught that very early, and it was not one that created any structural damage to the inside of the building.
But the central question of what to do with the building remained. The Pew Charitable Trust report found that in 12 big cities there were more than 560 shuttered schools in the interval between the years of 2005 and 2012. The study revealed that less than half of the decommissioned buildings in the big cities found a reuse. Of the buildings that were saved, 40% became charter schools. Sue Crull, a community sociologist and a parent whose children had walked to Roosevelt School, had her hopes high.
Well, all along, starting in 2005, we hoped to reopen it as a school. We tried a charter school approach. We had a beautiful application ready for charter school. But in Iowa, charter schools have to be approved by your school board, which makes it kind of strange, but that's the Iowa law. And so our parents, because it was a parents' initiative, I was a consultant as a community sociologist, and the parents presented it to the school board, and the school board, would consider it, read it, etc. Well, the superintendent announced to the high school faculty that he would have to drop a whole lot of programs, particularly sports, if this happened. Well, the parents just panicked because they didn't want to be known as the group who caused Ames to lose their sports and orchestra and band, etc. So they caved, and the committee voted, and the vote was to withdraw the charter school application.
Various groups and organizations were stakeholders in the Roosevelt outcome. So for roughly a 5 to 6 year period, proposals would surface for what to do with the building. Some wanted to just get rid of it. Others wanted the land leveled and affordable housing constructed. But along the way, a community advocacy group succeeded in having Roosevelt School put on the National Register of Historic Places, and they paid to have an architect evaluate the soundness of the structure. In other words, could it be reused? Adding momentum to the Save Roosevelt in some form was a group that was lobbying for the preservation of the playground as a city park.
Save the Building and Save the Park actually joined forces because in 2012, I think it was, the school board recommended that Roosevelt be demolished. And the irony there was it would cost more to demolish it than it would for them to sell the land. So they would be in a deficit by demolishing. And the Boone landfill said, if you ever take that building down, you know, you're going to fill up our whole landfill with cement. So that was kind of a joke. And so 3 of us in particular, Sharon Wirth, myself, and Irv Kloss, started working with news articles in the paper, letters to the editor. They finally featured us each presenting a guest column. We went to every school board meeting and spoke at every forum about, you know, you need to consider selling the building. Don't demolish the building.
And by 2012, demolition of the building was a real possibility. One of Sue Crull's fellow advocates was former Ames City Council member and longtime advocate for historic preservation, Sharon Wirth. She describes the efforts to keep the school standing.
I did not become involved until probably 2011, when suddenly there was a new school board elected, and they wanted to dispose of quite a number of properties that they had that were empty and were not being used for their purposes anymore. At the time this was happening, I was serving on the Historic Preservation Commission for the City of Ames, and I was chairing the commission at that time. So we were talking about it there. People were coming to us as individual members of the community, talking to us. People were coming to our meetings, talking to us about this building. Just in general, there are such, and there continues to be such incredibly strong community ties to this building and this site. It's a fair amount of letter writing, a fair amount of attending a number of meetings, whether those were school board meetings, whether they were real estate committee meetings. For whatever reason, the timing was right, I think. We had the right people, and we had enough of the right people providing some leadership and some passion. And they came forward to act as a catalyst, and when they came together, it was just a force. Part of that force was definitely the developer, Dean Jensen, coming forward at the right time. That was very, very critical because, as you said, often people have great ideas for historic buildings, but if somebody doesn't come forward to put up the money, to put in the energy, to put in the sweat equity to make it happen, it doesn't happen. So all of those things came together at the right time for this building.
Roosevelt School caught developer Dean Jensen's eye because he had recently renovated a school building outside of the Ames city limits in Story County for his home and office. That building, the old Milford School, constructed in 1923, was a contemporary of the Roosevelt building. His familiarity with the time period and the favorable location of Roosevelt in the so-called urban center of Ames, with walkability to downtown, were factors as he approached the school board with a bid to buy. In addition, Jensen believed that a condominium project with the adjacent park would not only be attractive, but would be economically viable for development.
Quite early in the process, after the school board started talking about demolition, and others of us in the community started talking about preserving the building, he expressed an interest in the building. The other thing that is, I believe, is so pivotal about Dean is his approach and his philosophy about old buildings, but also about working with people.
There was a fair amount of research done prior to making an offer to the school district. Surprisingly low, so it was $25,000, and immediately when we bought it, there were several $100,000 worth of work that had to be done, such as asbestos remediation, the tuck pointing, and all of the work that needed to be done immediately to save that building, just to rescue it. So the amount of purchase price is not reflective of what its value was.
And so we were very excited when Jensen bought it. And, you know, we had seen the property that he developed for his home, which was also an old school. So he knew what he was doing. When we met with him, you could tell that he definitely was very concerned about the look. He was very concerned about the use. He was very, very concerned about the neighborhood and how he wanted to fit in with the neighborhood.
It took process. It took a number of meetings and time to make that happen, but it was a very big team effort, a community effort. We started at that level because the project is in their backyard, and so we wanted to start at the level of the preserve Roosevelt.
Dean Jensen bought Roosevelt School and started multitasking. He was working with neighbors to keep the project true to the character of the area, talking with historic preservation experts, and in some cases yielding on things like balconies on the front of the building. At the same time, he was preparing the building for reshaping so there could be new interior spaces for living. He also had to market the project to prospective buyers. He describes the process as writing several chapters of a book.
But essentially, on a project like this, the demolition, as we've talked about, is the first part, and you're anxiously awaiting affirmation in my case. Affirming that things are where you thought they were. One of the nice things that we had were the original blueprints. So the school district invited me up to their little office, and we're able to thumb through and find the original blueprints, which will be a part of the Roosevelt's permanent collection. And on that, then we were able to transfer that to CAD and be able to know exactly where structure was at. So as we unveiled the project, it affirmed what we thought. And so that was chapter number one, is affirmation. You know, we mentioned the word rescue, so there's a big chapter in that you want to rescue more than you think, because you don't know how it might be inquired later. So we rescued a lot of truckloads of material did not go to the dump. They left the property for the sake of preserving them in a warehouse, and then we carefully brought them back, refinished, refurbished. So that's number two. I think number three, it has to do with editing, and editing always shows back up because you start, you make marks, and the project, the building, tells you what it wants to do or not do, things like width of hallways, transitions between floors. All those things are not necessarily driven by an architect on an AutoCAD, but they're driven by what the building will allow you to do practically. So there's this editing, kind of a dance with the project that you do. And then there's an educational part where the subcontractors that are selected have to understand that vision of preservation and marriage. And so a fair amount of time is spent in a classroom or a conference room going over concepts and ideas that are somewhat strange to certain people. They're strange as to why you can't just slam a pipe right where you want it and cover it up with sheetrock. That's not the way that project worked. So we had to carefully design those things, and there's an educational component within that. So that's another chapter. And then I think as the project started to take hold and take shape, there's a listening of the users, and so the buyers started to come about, and so their perspectives were integrated as well.
The original blueprints showed a sound building. Happily for Jensen and his crews, they discovered through the removal of some of the interior that Roosevelt was in fact a building with good bones.
We had a great building to start with. We set a plumb bob on 3rd floor, drilled a hole through 2nd, down into 1st.
But with any old building, there are surprises and difficulties.
Those are nightmares because you're in the guts of the building trying to make sure it's modernized and it's preservable for the next 50 to 100 years. And those things have to be done. They're not fun, but they're critical. And I think that those were the biggest challenges, is all the hidden things that you don't see on a typical tour. Well, when you convert, conversion often invites how do you do it? And things like plumbing, where it was set up to have boys' bathrooms, girl bathrooms, boy shower, girl shower. It wasn't set up for 20 living accommodations, so immediately the plumbing becomes a big topic. Well, it had the old system of boilers that originated with fuel oil and probably some coal kinds of rooms that originally fired that building up. Had no air conditioning, no insulation. One of the preservation elements that's important is to reduce the amount of outside noise.
Saving interior elements of the building that were evocative of the 1920s was both satisfying and frustrating. Many things had already been removed or were damaged, and others needed approval to be used in a new way. For example, many Roosevelt graduates had reminisced about the grand open staircases.
It had been, I use the word buried, into drywall. We were able to get permission from the city to unveil those staircases and restore them. One staircase was reasonably in order, and so we used that as a template and worked with a local welder, a local cabinet maker who rebuilt the other staircases to match. And so we were fortunately able to know what an original piece looked like and then carried that through the building.
The conceptual stage of the project began just before the demolition and the saving of building elements. Jensen invited prospective buyers to a series of informational meetings at his home. For Roosevelt School, he had envisioned a mix of 1, 2, and 3 bedroom condos in a variety of shapes and in building orientations, with a total of 23 units. At his first informational meeting, 5 buyers stepped forward to commit to the project. As some of the first to make pledges to buy, they were able to customize their space. In fact, half of the project has customized condos, with the owners closely involved.
I began to see and think about how very interesting and unusual the spaces could be. And so at that point, we said, this is a good idea. No outdoor maintenance. It's in the heart of Ames. We have lived in the urban core of Ames for many, many years, and as we were moving through life thinking about where will we be in the future, one of our issues was, geez, we really want to be in the urban core, but there isn't the kind of housing opportunity we might like. And so when this came along and we learned a little bit more about it, became comfortable working with Dean, we said, better just jump on the bandwagon. So we did. From the beginning, Dean's philosophy, and Dean and his team, was, you can shape your space. You can be involved as you want to in the decision making. So, we're going, oh, okay. And then, suddenly they started asking us questions. Do you want this? Do you want this? What about this? What about that? And we're going, oh, wow. So we decided we would either have to just
let them decide or we would decide. So we jumped in very early then, and came over a number of times and looked around the building and said, first off the decision was, where do you want to be in the building? And then the much more difficult decision of, how much space do you want in the building? So it was certainly a wonderful process. And so from the very beginning, the windows were just so critical, and not only to my husband and I as potential homeowners, but to anybody who was interested in preserving the building. The windows just were such key elements. Certainly the way they dealt with woodwork in terms of doing the research, finding out what that original woodwork looked like. The profiles of the trim are what was here originally. The profile of the doors are here what was originally. The newel posts have very similar details to the original newel posts just outside our doors.
Each condo has what is called a feature wall. In the Wirth's condo, it is the combination of fireplace and bookcases. The bookcases are not from Roosevelt, but they are from the same time period, and the grid pattern of the bookcase doors matches the grid pattern in the Roosevelt windows and the Roosevelt doors. On the Wirth's feature wall, in addition to their own materials, there are actual pieces saved from the original Roosevelt building.
If you look at the very top of the trim on the feature wall here, that is actually an original chalkboard tray from the school. And the dark wood that you see framing the upper panel there is all original Roosevelt woodwork also. We love living here. It is just a wonderful space. It's well designed, it's well constructed. It's in a beautiful neighborhood. It's in the core of downtown. It's quiet. We have wonderful people living in the building. You know, we could not ask for better neighbors. It's just all good.
There were many stakeholders in the process, including the school district, the neighborhood, historic preservationists, and of course, Dean Jensen.
So what drives a project like that is fulfillment of vision, meeting needs, understanding what that client's really wanting, and putting money into a little bit of a back seat to not cause that to be the driving factor. We were probably about 20% off of our projections in the projects.
And while meeting needs was the driving factor, any private development must make money. Dean Jensen declined to describe the profitability of the project, but he did say it was definitely worth the time and effort. The cost of construction was around $125 to $150 per square foot, and the condos sold, depending on the size and finish elements, for roughly $150,000 to $330,000. During the time that Roosevelt was being reimagined and rebuilt for a new use, other Ames School District properties met less favorable outcomes. The old Ames Middle School not only was unsuitable for reuse, but there were acrimonious battles about what to do with the land. Roosevelt was a bright spot at a time when the district needed one.
I think the real critical elements were a developer stepped forward. The building could be remodeled and repurposed into something else, which in this case is loft apartments, which is very sorely needed, I think. The neighborhood saw that their playground was going to stay there. The city has taken that over as part of their city park organization, so that's about as happy an ending as you can possibly get.
And yet, some people were wistful about the vanishing classrooms in the city center.
The neighborhood still talks about it. The neighborhood, when we see the children get on the bus to go to Meeker, they still go, oh, if they could just, they could have walked to Roosevelt so easily. Well, definitely, because the building looks beautiful. The park is wonderful. So even though we don't have a school, we have something very, very nice. And I think several people in the neighborhood are very proud that it looks so nice and the park is there for the kids. So I think it was the best that we could do.
You know, I guess as a longtime neighborhood advocate and preservation advocate, it is so rewarding to be involved in a project and to see a positive thing happen in the end. And I just cannot imagine any kind of a project that could have a better result than this one did.
Sharon and her husband Don Wirth are not the only residents extremely happy with the reconfigured Roosevelt. Their upstairs neighbors, Jim and Julie Popkin, now live in a condominium that includes a loft, space that was rediscovered in the demolition process and put to a new, creative use. While many people are happy with the reimagined Roosevelt building, some are aware that the refurbished structure is not the typical result for decommissioned buildings. Most buildings experienced a less happy ending. So what made a difference for Roosevelt?
How we've ended here on the project with great relationships and a great perspective on the struggle that this kind of project brings to many urban communities around the country, and so it's been a very great process.
Starting and sustaining a process can be daunting. On a national level, the Pew Charitable Trust's report states, no matter how well a district goes about it, the process of repurposing surplus property remains inherently difficult, politically, financially, logistically, and emotionally. Both on a local and a national level, the repurposing of Roosevelt Elementary School defied the odds.
It's fabulous. It's absolutely wonderful. Schools can be changed into a wonderful thing for communities.
Oatmeal chocolate chip. Oh yeah, just lift that up, sorry. You're welcome.